She was only 11 years old, and what her stepfather did to her changed everything. Today we are going to learn about Laura's story. Get ready to be moved along with me. No one imagined that behind that sweet gaze, there was a girl who cried silently every night. No one imagined that Laura, at just 11 years old, was hiding a secret that crushed her inside. A secret that destroyed her childhood, but that one day would be the strength that would save many other lives. If this story touches you in any way, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Laura's pain needs to be known, because there are thousands of girls living the same darkness right now. And together, our voices can be the beginning of change. Laura was the kind of child who was easily captivated. Always polite, always smiling, always helpful. She was the kind of girl that people said was an angel. And maybe she really was. But even angels bleed when they are hurt inside. She lived with her mother and stepfather. Her mother was her safe haven, even though she was always tired, torn between work shifts and trying to keep the house in order. As for her stepfather, he was the reason for everything that hurt. At first, nothing seemed wrong. He was too kind, too attentive, too present. But over time, his gestures changed. His presence became invasive. His touches became threatening. And fear began to live with Laura. She didn't understand why she felt so dirty after he left the room. She couldn't explain why she cried when no one was looking. She only knew that something inside her was breaking, little by little, without making a sound. The worst part was the confusion. How to explain to a child's mind that someone who was supposed to protect her was robbing her of her peace? How to cry for help when everyone thinks she's safe? Laura tried to give signs. She tried to look different, speak differently, ask for help between the lines. But the adults around her were too busy, too distracted, or simply didn't want to see. Her mother, perhaps out of denial, perhaps out of fear, refused to believe her. And that was the most painful blow. Because when the person you love most chooses not to see your pain, the whole world falls apart. So, Laura learned to survive in silence. She created an invisible shield to endure each night. She swallowed the urge to scream and molded a fake smile to continue being the perfect girl. She lived like that for years, slowly fading away. Until the day she heard a teacher talk about child sexual abuse. That hit her like a lightning bolt. Suddenly, everything made sense. What she was experiencing had a name. And more than that, it wasn't her fault. It was with that discovery that something changed. The frightened girl began to wake up. There was still a lot of fear, but now there was also a truth that could no longer be ignored. That night, Laura didn't sleep. She stayed awake thinking about what she would do with what she knew. She knew it would be difficult. She knew that maybe no one would believe her. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. Because the truth had given her something that fear never offered, hope. And so began Laura's journey. A journey marked by pain, silence and resistance. But also by courage, healing and transformation. Because, despite everything, she was still there. And inside her, there was a strength that not even the worst abuse could extinguish. Laura spent the following days as if she carried a burning secret inside her chest. Now she knew. She knew what it was that hurt her so much. She knew that what was happening to her was not normal, and that changed everything. The realization, however, did not come with relief. On the contrary, knowing what it was only made everything even heavier. Because now, in addition to the pain, there was the urgency to do something. But to do what? She tried to write. She sat down with a notebook on her lap and, with trembling hands, tried to put into words what she felt. But the sentences got stuck. The memories came like knives. The shame was still greater than the courage. At school, she began to see everything with different eyes. She noticed the other girls. She wondered if anyone else was going through what she was going through. She imagined how many similar stories there were out there, hidden behind clean uniforms and practiced smiles. Laura wanted to scream, but the scream was stuck in her throat. And fear was a ghost that whispered that no one would believe her, that if she spoke, she would lose her mother, that she could end up in an even worse place. She began to avoid her stepfather. She changed rooms. She locked the bedroom door whenever she could. But that only made him more impatient, more invasive, more threatening. And Laura knew that time was running out. One night, when she heard the sound of his footsteps coming down the hallway, Laura felt a strange force grow inside her. A mixture of panic and fury. And, for the first time, she locked the door before he came in. He tried to open it. He called her name in his usual soft voice. But she didn't answer. She sat on the floor, trembling, with her eyes fixed on the doorknob. She knew that at that moment she had done something important, even though she didn't understand exactly what. The next day, her stepfather pretended to be normal. She drank coffee, complimented the food, asked about school. But there was something different in his eyes. As if he knew Laura was changing. And that bothered him. Laura started writing little sentences on loose leaves and hiding them in unlikely places. Inside books, behind paintings, inside shoeboxes. As if she was leaving clues for someone to find. As if she was preparing her own rescue. But she was still just a child. And the weight of it all seemed unbearable at times. Some mornings, she thought about disappearing. About disappearing so that no one would have to deal with the mess she carried inside. But in the midst of all this, there was a moment of light. A teacher, noticing something different in her behavior, called her to talk. It was the first time someone had looked Laura in the eyes with real attention, and that caused a crack to appear in the wall of silence. Laura didn't tell her everything. She still couldn't. But she cried. She cried like she had never cried before. And the teacher didn't interrupt her, didn't try to explain, didn't question her. She just stayed there. Present. And in that moment, something changed. It was the beginning of an opening. A small space through which the truth could one day escape. But there was still a long way to go. And Laura knew, facing the monster would be harder than anything she had ever experienced. However, now she was no longer completely alone. And that, as small as it seemed, was what kept her going. Because sometimes, all a girl needs to survive is someone who finally sees the pain she has tried to hide for so long. The days passed, but that silent conversation with the teacher was etched in Laura like a deep mark. It was as if, for the first time, someone had seen what she had tried to hide from everyone, including herself. Even without words, something was understood in that moment. And that understanding made room for a different kind of courage. A silent, fragile courage, but one that was beginning to grow inside her. Laura still couldn't say clearly what was happening. The words seemed too big, too heavy, too dangerous. But the tears she shed that day were the first real gesture she was able to offer the world. The teacher, even without going into details, began to observe Laura more closely. She created spaces for her to feel safe. Small gestures, a question, a sincere compliment, a pause in the middle of class, everything now seemed carefully aimed at making her feel that she mattered. At home, nothing changed. Her stepfather maintained his facade of a respectable man. He continued to smile when he visited, joked with neighbors, greeted acquaintances on the street. He was a trained actor, and Laura knew very well the role he played. But something in him was beginning to get restless. Perhaps he sensed that Laura was moving away, that something in her had awakened. His approach began to change tone. Less feigned, more threatening. Now, his looks were filled with a silent warning. "Don't you dare speak." Laura slept badly. She had nightmares. She woke up sweating, crying, with her breath caught. In many of these dreams, she screamed, but no one heard her. And even after waking up, the feeling of suffocation continued. It was on one of these nights that she did something different. She wrote a letter. It was short, but sincere. It told what was happening. She didn't sign it. She didn't say who it was for. She just wrote it and put it in her backpack, without knowing exactly what she would do with it. At school, she kept the letter with her at all times. She thought about leaving it on the teacher's desk, putting it in the principal's suggestion box, throwing it away. But something told her that the piece of paper was more than just words. It was the key to a door she didn't yet know how to open. In the meantime, the teacher was still there. And Laura began to create little codes with her. A longer look, a hand gesture, a long pause at the end of class. As if, somehow, they were agreeing on something without having to say it. The letter stayed in her backpack for days. Laura felt that it wasn't the right time yet. But knowing that it existed, that, somewhere, the truth was written, gave her a silent strength. Her stepfather, noticing the change in her behavior, began to get irritated more easily. He couldn't hide it as well anymore. His eyes, previously covered by a mask of kindness, now showed sparks of anger, fear, control. Laura knew she was at a breaking point, that something big was about to happen. She could feel it in the air, in her body, in her heart. It was as if the whole story was tilting toward an abyss, or a leap. And in the midst of it all, a decision had to be made. Continue pretending, surviving between false smiles and painful silences, or finally open her mouth and let the world know the truth. Laura was still just a girl. But there was a strength inside her that, little by little, was beginning to awaken. And when that strength was fully awakened, no one would be able to silence it again. The morning Laura finally delivered the letter was silent, almost solemn. The sky was gray, and the wind seemed to whisper something she couldn't decipher. As she left the house, her steps were light, but her heart felt as heavy as a stone. In her backpack, the letter was carefully folded. The paper had fingerprints, small creases on the edges, signs that it had been touched and reread many times. Laura didn't know exactly what she expected, but she knew she couldn't carry it alone anymore. She arrived at school early. The teacher hadn't yet entered the classroom. She took advantage of the moment and placed the letter under the teacher's notebook, with bated breath and trembling hands. It was quick, almost automatic. But what she did there would change everything. During class, Laura kept her eyes on the board, pretending to concentrate. But inside, fear and hope were fighting a battle. She imagined 1,000 possible scenarios. She wondered if the teacher would understand. She wondered if there would be consequences. She thought, and tried not to panic. At the end of class, the teacher collected the materials as usual, but when she saw the letter, she stopped for a few seconds. She didn't open it there. She just looked at Laura and then put the paper in her bag, with a care that the girl would never forget. At that moment, Laura felt that she had been heard, even without words. It was a new feeling, almost strange, as if part of the weight that had been with her for years had finally begun to come off. That day, the teacher didn't come back to the classroom after the break. Another teacher took over the rest of the classes. Laura pretended not to notice, but deep down, she knew that the wheels had started to turn. The truth, once out in the open, had a life of its own. Later, when she got home, Laura tried to act naturally. Her stepfather was there, as always, smiling as if nothing could touch him. But she was no longer the same. Not completely. There was a flame burning inside her, still fragile, but real. The next day, the principal called Laura discreetly. There was no fuss, no rush. Just a calm invitation to talk. The girl walked to the classroom with slow steps, feeling that the moment she had feared for so long had arrived. The principal greeted her with a serious but kind look. Next to her was a woman Laura didn't know. She identified herself as a psychologist from the Child Support Network. And for the first time, someone told her in so many words, "You are safe now." Those words broke something inside her. And instead of fear, tears appeared. A deep cry, stifled for years. Laura cried without explaining herself, without justifying herself. She just let it all out. It was as if she was, little by little, cleansing her soul. The conversation was long, but respectful. No one pressured her. No one doubted her. Every word she said was treated as truth, as something precious. And that, for a child like Laura, was more than justice. It was reparation. After that morning, measures began to be taken. The school followed protocol. The protection network was activated. And, for the first time, the eyes of the law began to turn to the man who had destroyed her childhood. Laura didn't come home that day. She was taken to a temporary shelter while the investigation continued. The shock was great. The pain of leaving her mother, the fear of what would come, everything mixed together inside her. But even so, she knew she was on the right path. Now, far from the place where the abuse happened, Laura began a new kind of battle. That of rebuilding herself. Of trying to understand what had happened to her and, most importantly, of discovering who she was without the constant fear. And so, the silence that had imprisoned her for so long began to give way to something new. To a voice. A voice that still trembled, but that, finally, began to rise. The shelter where Laura was taken in was simple, but welcoming. The walls had drawings made by other children, and the smell of home-cooked food spread through the hallways. Still, nothing in that place could completely calm the storm that she carried inside. She didn't cry on the first day. Nor did she speak much. She just observed, trying to understand if she was really safe there. It was hard to believe. Years of living surrounded by fear and distrust had taught her body to always be on alert. The other girls in the shelter came from different backgrounds, but with similar traits. Some were more talkative, others more reserved. There were looks that recognized each other in the silence. Laura, even without saying a word, knew she wasn't the only one. During the first few days, she spent a lot of time sitting in the garden, looking at the trees. There was one in particular, with a crooked trunk and long branches, that caught her attention. It seemed to have weathered many storms, and yet remained standing. The psychologist who was with her was patient. She never forced anything. She just showed up every day, sat next to Laura and stayed there, even in silence. Little by little, this created a bridge. Small, but firm. It was there, in that garden, that Laura spoke for the first time. It wasn't much. Just a few loose words about how difficult it was to sleep. But the psychologist's reaction was the most important. She didn't try to fix it. She just listened. This silent listening was what Laura needed most. Over the days, the girl began to trust, to open small windows into her story. She told it little by little, stopping when the lump in her throat tightened. But each time she spoke, she felt a little lighter. Meanwhile, the shelter staff and the professionals involved continued the legal process. Laura's stepfather was already being investigated, and the case gained momentum as the testimonies and evidence were gathered. Laura's mother was called to testify. Shocked, she denied it at first. She said it was impossible, that Laura must be making it up. But over time, faced with the evidence and her daughter's attitude, she began to question everything she thought she knew. This denial from her mother hurt more than any words. Laura hoped, even without admitting it, that her mother would at least hug her, that she would believe her, that she would be on her side. But that didn't happen. At least, not right away. The pain of rejection opened a new wound. But it also brought something that Laura did not expect, a raw, intense strength that came from within. It was as if, faced with the lack of support from her own mother, she discovered that she would need to be her own foundation. It was at that moment that she asked for a notebook. She said she wanted to write. The psychologist encouraged her, and Laura began to put on paper what she still could not say out loud. The memories, the fears, the sleepless nights. Everything took shape between the pages. Writing became a kind of refuge. A territory where she had control. Where she could name her pain without being interrupted, without being judged. It was there, with the pen in her hand, that she began to reconnect with parts of herself that she had buried. She was still just a child, but her words carried the weight of a grown-up. And by writing, Laura began, even without realizing it, to transform her pain into something more. Something that, one day, could break through the silence of other girls too. At the shelter, the days were becoming less frightening. There were still wounds, there was still fear. But for the first time, Laura was in a place where her story was heard, where her existence was recognized, and where her courage was finally blossoming. The days at the shelter followed their own rhythm. The routine was simple, but each act of care seemed to rebuild something inside Laura. Little things that, for many, would go unnoticed, like someone remembering her name, asking how she was, or offering her a glass of warm milk before bed, became symbols of a world that was gradually ceasing to be hostile. Laura still didn't smile easily. Her eyes, large and attentive, carried the weight of everything she had experienced. But there was a difference now. She no longer hid so much. She began to participate in group activities, even if silently, even if just observing. The notebook she had asked for had become a faithful companion. It was where she put the fears she still couldn't name and the memories that appeared at the most unexpected moments. Each page filled was a kind of silent victory over trauma. Over time, the professionals who were with Laura noticed something different about her. Despite her difficult history, despite the pain still fresh in her, there was a precocious maturity in her. A depth that came not only from her suffering, but from the way she faced it. It was on a rainy afternoon that Laura did something surprising. During a conversation, she asked to read an excerpt of what she had written. Her voice was low and hesitant, but each word she said seemed to make room in the hearts of those who listened. She spoke about fear, yes. About the dark nights, the touches that hurt, the silence that swallowed her. But she also spoke about resistance. About how, even without knowing it, she always tried to survive. About how, even though she was broken, she had chosen to carry on. The other girls listened in silence. Some cried. Others approached her later, touching her shoulder, saying, "Me too." And it was at that moment that Laura realized something that would change everything. Her story, as painful as it was not just hers. She understood that there were others like her. Other silenced voices, other wounded bodies, other stolen childhoods. And that, perhaps, if she had the courage to keep talking, she could light a small light in the darkness of other girls too. This did not erase the pain. It did not lessen the trauma. But it gave new meaning to everything. Laura began to write more frequently, now thinking about who might read her words. She began to imagine that, perhaps one day, she could share her notebooks with the world. In this process, her relationship with the psychologist grew even stronger. The sessions stopped being just spaces of pain, and also became places of discovery. Laura began to talk not only about what happened, but also about what she felt about herself. For the first time, she was asked what she dreamed of being when she grew up. She remained silent for a while. Then, she answered with something that she didn't even expect. "I want to help other girls. Just like you are helping me." It was the first time she saw herself on the other side of the story. Not as a victim, but as someone capable of transforming. And this idea, that she could not only survive, but do something with her pain, took root in her heart like a seed. Meanwhile, the case against her stepfather moved forward. The evidence gathered, the psychological reports, the testimonies. Everything pointed to the truth that Laura had been carrying alone for so long. Justice, still slow, was finally beginning to move. Her mother, faced with everything, began to back away from her denials. Her lost look, her dejected expression. It was no longer possible to pretend. But Laura, even though she wanted answers, no longer expected them. She had learned that some people cannot offer what we need, and that this does not define our worth. In the solitude of her pain, Laura now found a way to start over. She was still fragile, she still hurt, but it was no longer just darkness. There was a strength that was slowly emerging, like sunlight after a long night. It didn't take long for the news that Laura wanted to help other girls to circulate within the shelter. Not as gossip, but as hope. Something inside her had changed, and this change was felt by everyone around her. It was as if, little by little, Laura was no longer just a survivor and was becoming a beacon. The shelter coordinator saw potential in that desire. With the support of the psychologist, she proposed a small conversation circle just for girls. Nothing forced. Just a safe space, where those who wanted to could talk, and those who didn't, could just listen. Laura accepted the invitation with trepidation. She was still afraid of saying too much. Afraid of remembering. Afraid of not being ready. But she also knew that, somewhere inside her, something was pushing her forward. So she went. She sat in the circle, took a deep breath, and began. The words came slowly. There was no script. There was no rush. She didn't tell everything at once, but enough for the other girls to recognize themselves. She talked about the pain, yes, but also about the day she wrote the letter, and about the relief she felt when she was heard. The other girls, upon seeing Laura speak, also began to open their own silences. Some told similar stories. Others just cried. But all of them, somehow, found in that exchange a crack through which air could enter again. The circle became a habit. A healing ritual. Once a week, they sat on the floor of the cafeteria when the place was already empty. And there, amidst tears, restrained smiles and long silences, they built together something that none of them had had before: belonging. Laura, without realizing it, became a silent leader. She didn't talk more than the others. She didn't put herself above them. But she was listened to with respect. She was seen as someone who had hit rock bottom, and still came back to lend a hand. During this period, she began to study with more focus. School, which had previously been just a place to pass through, became a place to conquer. Each high grade, each compliment from the teachers, was a reminder that the past would not define her future. It was also during this phase that a special invitation came. A project by the Public Defender's Office with the shelter wanted to anonymously record the stories of girls who had been victims of abuse. Laura was one of the first to accept. Not to expose her pain, but to transform it. The text she wrote moved everyone. Even without mentioning names, dates, or places, there was a raw truth in each line. The defender who read it was silent for minutes. And then, with tears in her eyes, she said, "This story will save other lives." Laura still didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't have all the answers, nor all the strength all the time. There were nights when she cried in secret. Days when her body still trembled when she remembered. But now she knew that this was part of the journey, that it was all part of the process. Her relationship with her mother remained distant. There was no reconciliation, no sweet words, just silence. But Laura no longer expected that. She had learned that not everyone will understand, not everyone will stay. And that surviving also means moving on without certain people. Over time, Laura's notebooks began to multiply. Stories, thoughts, reflections. Some sad, others hopeful. It was her way of organizing the world within her. And, little by little, this world began to make more sense. She still didn't have a clear plan for how she would help other victims in the future. But she was unshakably certain her voice would no longer be silenced. Never again. The silence that had destroyed her for so long was now a tool for reconstruction. And so, Laura continued. One step at a time. Still wounded, but increasingly whole. With enough courage to face her own story, and enough generosity to use this pain as a bridge for others who were still searching for a way out. It was hard to believe that the girl who had barely been able to look up before was now walking through the halls of the shelter with a different posture. There was something new about Laura. It wasn't arrogance, nor false security. It was the silent firmness of someone who had gone through the abyss and chosen to return. But not every day was good. There were setbacks. Moments when a memory would come out of nowhere and knock everything down. A smell, a louder noise, a misplaced word, and Laura would feel her heart racing as if she were still trapped in that dark room from the past. It was on one of those difficult nights that she tore an entire page out of her notebook. The words were jumbled, full of anger. For the first time, she couldn't organize what she was feeling. She just wanted it all to go away. For the pain to evaporate once and for all. The next day, the psychologist noticed Laura's heavy silence and didn't insist. She sat down next to her, as she always did, and stayed there. Her calm presence was like an anchor. Laura knew that when she was ready, she could speak, and that was enough. Later that same day, Laura went back to her notebook. She took another sheet of paper and wrote, "I had a bad day. But it wasn't the end. I'm still here." And as she finished that sentence, she closed her eyes and felt something strange, as if that simple statement were a small victory. Justice, on the other hand, followed its own time. The stepfather's trial was scheduled. The public defender's office was working to hold him accountable, but the process was slow and exhausting. Laura was carefully informed about each step. They didn't want her to be caught off guard. There were discussions about whether or not she would testify in court. The shelter staff and the lawyers knew the emotional impact of this. But when Laura learned of the possibility, she said something that no one expected. "If it's necessary, I'll speak up. I'm not afraid of him anymore." It wasn't an easy decision. But hearing it from the mouth of a girl who had been silenced for so long brought a respectful silence to the room. Everyone there knew the weight that that statement carried. Even so, they made the decision to protect Laura. The material she had written, along with the psychological counseling and the reports, was enough. The law allowed her not to have to relive everything in court. And that protected her. Meanwhile, at the shelter, the conversation circles gained momentum. Other girls began to write too. Inspired by Laura, they began to record their own experiences, even if they didn't share everything. It was a way of coping, of surviving. The coordinator saw an opportunity in this movement. She created a small internal project called Voices of Silence, where each girl could write, draw, or simply express whatever she wanted. Laura was the first to be invited as a mentor. She didn't like this title very much. She said she was still trying to understand herself, but she accepted it humbly. She knew that, in some way, her journey helped others take the first step, and that was what mattered most. One afternoon, Laura met a new girl at the shelter. She was sitting alone, with a lost look in her eyes, holding an old doll in her arms. Without saying anything, Laura sat next to her. They remained silent. After a few minutes, she simply said, "I know how it is. Whenever you want to talk, I'll be here." That simple and sincere sentence summed up everything Laura had become. Someone who no longer needed to tell her pain to prove her strength. Someone who understood that listening was also a way to save. That late afternoon, as the sky slowly darkened, Laura looked at the horizon and thought that perhaps, for the first time, she was truly building something new. A tomorrow that did not deny yesterday, but was no longer a prisoner of it either. The day of the hearing arrived with a silent weight. Even though she did not have to appear in court, Laura felt the tension of that moment in her body. It was as if everything she had experienced was being judged there, finally exposed before justice. The movement at the shelter was discreet. The coordinator and the psychologist avoided giving too many details, but assured Laura that they were following her every step. She spent the day restless, pacing back and forth, with her notebook closed in her hands. It was strange to think that a man she had learned to fear would now have to hear her truths, even if through paper. The monster that had kept her silent for so long was now being forced to listen. This was scary, yes. But it also brought an unprecedented sense of reparation. During the afternoon, the defender called the shelter. She wanted to speak to Laura. The call was put on speakerphone, and the woman, in a firm voice, summarized. Laura's written testimony, along with the psychological reports and exams, were accepted as compelling evidence. She explained that the judge had been moved by the depth of the story, and that the public prosecutor's office was pushing the case with more force than usual. There was a real chance of conviction. And more than that, of visibility for the case. Laura listened in silence. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She just closed her eyes for a moment and nodded. It was as if a door was beginning to open inside her. It wasn't complete freedom yet, but it was a clear step in that direction. In the following days, Laura continued her routine with the same care as always. But there was something different in the way she walked, in the tone of her speech. She was no longer the same girl who carried fear like a constant shadow. Now, she also carried a sense of justice. She began to write a new series of texts. This time, not only about what she had experienced, but about what she believed in. She spoke about rights, about protection, about the importance of reporting. She wrote as if she wanted to reach girls who were still trapped in silence. One of the educators at the shelter, upon reading one of these texts, made a suggestion. He asked if Laura would accept having her writings read at an event organized by a child protection NGO. She hesitated, but after thinking about it, she said, "Yes, as long as they don't use my name." And so it was done. On the day of the event, one of Laura's texts was read aloud to an audience of adults and young people. When she finished, there was a deep silence. Some people cried. Others applauded respectfully. No one knew who the author was, but everyone felt the power of those words. Laura found out about the repercussions the next day. They said that several people asked who had written that story, and that many left the event more aware, more attentive, more willing to listen and welcome victims. Laura smiled discreetly. That was more than she had expected. Meanwhile, at the shelter, a new generation of girls arrived. Each one with their own pain, their own story, their own urgency. Laura observed them carefully. She did not act as a guide, but as a presence. She was someone who understood, and for that, she was respected. On one of those afternoons, a young girl, only 10 years old, looked at Laura and asked, "Are you also afraid of sleeping?" Laura answered honestly, "I was. For a long time. But not anymore." The girl nodded, without saying anything. And for the first time, she slept through the night. For Laura, these small victories were more significant than any sentence. Knowing that her pain could generate acceptance, that her story could provide shelter, was a form of healing that no justice could offer. And even without knowing everything that lay ahead, Laura began to understand that she was building something much bigger than she had imagined. Her journey would not end there. She was just beginning to discover the reach of her own voice. A few weeks had passed since the hearing. The case was still moving forward, and by all indications, the outcome was near. Laura didn't ask about it every day, but the subject was always lurking in the corners of her mind. It was like a shadow, invisible, but present. The shelter coordinator called Laura in for a private conversation. They sat in the office, the door closed, the room silent. She was direct, but with a gentleness in her voice. Her stepfather had been convicted. The courts had acknowledged the crime, and he would serve his sentence. Laura stood still. For a moment, time seemed to stop. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She just took a deep breath and stared at a spot on the wall. That was it. It was done. For the first time since it all began, there was an official word: guilty. It was a confusing feeling. There was no celebration. There was no complete relief. But there was something different. Some of the weight she was carrying seemed to have been lifted. As if the world, albeit late, had finally acknowledged her pain. That night, Laura wrote a letter. Not for him. Not for her mother. But for herself. She wrote everything she wanted to hear when she was still just a girl, locked away in silence. You didn't deserve what happened. And you are no one's fault. She put the letter in the back of a drawer. It was hers alone. A reminder that, even though she was hurt, she had made it this far. That she was not only a survivor, she was also the author of her own reconstruction. The conviction of the aggressor brought other movements. The NGO that had read her texts sought out the shelter. They wanted to create a prevention campaign and wanted to use excerpts from the material written by Laura, while maintaining her anonymity. She hesitated, but accepted. That was how her words began to circulate. In folders, educational videos, conversation circles. People who would never know her were being touched by the power of what she wrote in silence, on nights when the past weighed more than her body could bear. The psychologist observed everything with special care. He noticed Laura's maturity, but he also knew that, behind her strength, there were still weaknesses. And he respected that. No wound that deep can heal completely without leaving marks. In one of the meetings, He asked if Laura had ever thought about the future. The girl calmly replied, "I do. But not like before. Now I don't want to run away from it. I want to do something with all of this." It was a new desire, to change, to act. The shelter, realizing how much Laura positively influenced the other girls, offered her the chance to participate in a basic social mediation course aimed at young people. It was something small, but symbolic. A new step. Laura accepted. She participated in the classes attentively, even though she was the youngest among those enrolled. She observed everything, took notes, and listened to stories from other teenagers who also had pain to bear. For the first time, she felt that she was not alone in the world. During the course, she discovered new words for old feelings. She learned about limits, about active listening, about community reconstruction. And each concept learned seemed to fit into a part of her own story. It was as if, finally, everything was starting to make sense. The last day of the course was marked by a presentation. Each young person could talk, if they wanted, about what they had learned. Laura stood up, walked to the front of the room and, in a firm voice, said, "Pain doesn't define anyone. What we do with it does." There was silence after her speech. One of those silences that says it all. Laura returned to her seat, sat down calmly and looked out the window. Outside, the sky was clear. For the first time, she felt that, despite everything, she was exactly where she needed to be. After finishing the course, Laura began to see the shelter with different eyes. That place that had previously been just a refuge, now also became a space of possibilities. It was as if, little by little, she was occupying a new place within herself. The educators noticed the change. Laura had become a constant presence in conversations with the younger girls. She didn't talk about herself, but she knew how to listen. She knew what to ask, when to keep quiet, how to be present without intruding. It was a sensitivity that cannot be learned from books. One of the coordinators, touched by Laura's maturity, asked if she would like to participate in a pilot internal mentoring project at the shelter. It would be something informal. She would accompany a new foster child, helping her adapt. Laura hesitated, but said yes. That was how she met Isadora, a scared 12-year-old girl who barely spoke and wouldn't let go of a stuffed bear that was already all torn up. Laura approached her carefully. She didn't ask any questions. She just sat next to her on the first day and stayed there, silent. In the following days, Isadora began to respond with small nods, then with firmer looks, until one day she said, "You also came from a bad home, right?" Laura nodded, without going into details. "But you don't seem afraid." Laura smiled slightly. "Because now I know what protects me." That sentence kept echoing in Isadora's mind. And in Laura's too. It was true. She already knew what protected her. It wasn't just the shelter, nor the walls, nor the adults around her. It was something that had grown inside her, silently, since the day she decided to tell her story. While she was taking care of Isadora, Laura also started to plan something new. She wanted to write a small book. Not a biography, not yet. But a collection of letters. Letters that were never sent, that perhaps never would be. But that needed to exist. She spent her nights writing in a simple notebook. She gave the recipients fictitious names, to the girl who is afraid of the dark, to the one who blames herself in silence, to the one who thinks she doesn't deserve love. Each letter was like a mirror that she looked at herself, page after page. The shelter's psychologist found out about the writings and asked to read a few pages. Laura, shy, handed over the notebook with trembling hands. A few days later, the professional called her. She wanted to propose something. How about turning those letters into a real project, published with the support of the NGO? The idea scared her. Not because of the exposure, since her name would not be revealed, but because of the grandiosity of the proposal. What she had written between tears and memories could now touch other lives in an even more direct way. It was intimidating, but also powerful. Laura thought about it for days. She talked to the psychologist and the coordinator, until one night she said yes. The NGO received the material and, with the care that the story required, began the process of organizing it. The notebook would become a small, free digital book, aimed at adolescents at risk. Meanwhile, Isadora began to smile more. She slept better. She talked to other girls. And whenever she felt weak, she sought out Laura. That discreet and delicate relationship was a living seed, growing in the fertile soil of shelter. For Laura, each small step forward that Isadora took was also a form of healing. Not that the past stopped hurting, it was still there. But seeing another girl blossoming by her side was proof that pain, when transformed, can become a bridge instead of a wall. On a silent afternoon, sitting on a bench in the courtyard, Laura wrote a final letter. Not to publish, not to show. It was just for herself. It began with, "Dear Laura, today I finally believe in you." And there, in that simple sentence, fit everything she had never heard when she needed it most. But now, finally, she was able to say it to herself. The book of letters was launched discreetly. No event, no interview, no image. Just a link, shared by the NGO on its social networks, accompanied by a short text, "Letters to those who almost gave up." Signed only by L. At first, Laura didn't believe anyone would actually read it. She thought that, like so many other things in the world, the project would get lost in the speed of news, in the noise of the networks. But that wasn't what happened. Within a few days, messages began to pour in. Some teenagers sent emails to the NGO saying that, for the first time, they felt understood. Others thanked them for putting into words what they had never been able to express. And there were those who, in silence, simply downloaded the book and read it. The shelter coordinator printed out some of these messages and gave them to Laura. She spent hours reading them, her heart aching. She didn't cry. But something inside her was broken and rebuilt at the same time. It was as if she had finally managed to reach someone on the other side of the pain. One day, during a conversation circle at the shelter, a girl who never spoke asked to read one of the letters out loud. The room fell silent. Laura was there, listening to her own words spoken by another. It was one of the most intense moments of her life. The psychologist, observing everything, suggested something new, that Laura help organize small weekly meetings for reading and reflection. It would be a safe space for anyone who wanted to talk, or just listen. Laura accepted, but with one condition, that no story would be forced out early. That's how Letter Nights was born. On Wednesdays, after dinner, some of the girls would gather in the small room at the back. Low lights, hot tea, pillows on the floor. A ritual of listening. A pact of silence and respect. Laura was not a leader. She was a presence. She read one letter a week, and let the group lead the rest. Sometimes the meeting was silent, other times someone would open up and speak for the first time. There was pain, yes, but there was also laughter. A shy but honest laugh that emerged like a flower between cracks. Isadora was always there. She would sit next to Laura and, from time to time, whisper, "This letter sounds like my story." And Laura would respond with a look that said it all. "I know." The shelter began to change. Not in structure, but in atmosphere. The girls were more connected to each other. The pain, which had previously isolated, now united. It was as if, together, they had discovered a secret language of survival. A language made of listening, care, and truth. Outside the shelter, the book continued to spread. Some schools began to use excerpts in awareness-raising activities. Psychologists mentioned the project in support groups. The NGO, surprised by the repercussion, invited Laura to write more, if she wanted. She responded with a short note, "I'm still writing inside myself. But I promise to keep going." Laura began to carry a notebook in her pocket. She would jot down random phrases, feelings, memories. She didn't know yet if it would become another book, but she knew she needed to record it. It was as if she were putting together pieces of a puzzle that was, at the same time, hers and many others. On a rainy night, alone on the shelter's porch, she looked up at the dark sky and thought about how much she had changed. She wasn't cured. There were still difficult nights, nightmares, memories that came back without asking permission. But now she knew, she wasn't sinking anymore. And no matter how heavy the past was, Laura was learning, little by little, to use it all as a route. Because sometimes, it is precisely from pain that the courage to change the world is born, one letter at a time. Over time, Laura's story began to go beyond the shelter's walls in an even more concrete way. A local newspaper wrote an article about the letter project, protecting her identity, but highlighting the power of the gesture of transforming pain into acceptance. The story spread. Schools, NGOs and support centers contacted the organization responsible for the shelter. They wanted to replicate the letter nights. They wanted to understand how that young woman had managed to create a bridge between pain and healing. Laura, however, remained firm in her anonymity. She didn't want faces, she didn't want fame. She knew that her name wasn't the most important thing in the story. What mattered was that other girls, like Isadora, had the chance to find shelter within themselves. It was during this period that a new proposal came to her. The NGO invited her to participate, in a protected manner, in a national support network for victims of abuse. She would initially be a listener. She could attend the virtual meetings and, if she felt ready, share her impressions. Laura hesitated for a few days. The idea of hearing other stories so similar to hers scared her. She knew it would be like opening old wounds. But she also knew she was no longer alone. And that made all the difference. She accepted. In the first meetings, she remained silent. She listened to everything, took notes, felt. The voices on the other side of the screen, even from a distance, carried familiar tones. girls and women in search of language, in search of a place where they could exist without fear. One night, a member of the network read an excerpt from a letter that had changed her life. To the girl who thinks she will never trust anyone again. Laura recognized those words. They were hers. And she felt the impact as if it were the first time she had written them. After that meeting, she knew she had to keep going. Not just writing, but finding ways to be present for other girls who, like her, had experienced silence. She began to study more about active listening, about trauma, about emotional reconstruction. Little by little, the withdrawn girl transformed into a determined young woman. There was still fear, yes, but now there was also purpose. And that changed everything. It was as if Laura was finally beginning to build her own voice with the steady hands of someone who had survived. In the shelter, the days went by peacefully. Isadora was now drawing a lot. She said that when she got out of there, she wanted to be an illustrator. Laura encouraged her, bought colored pencils with the little she earned from the NGO, and smiled watching her friend trace shapes with such delicacy. But something was approaching, Laura's coming of age. She would turn 18 in a few months. And with that would come her departure from the shelter. It was a moment that many feared. It was the end of formal protection. The beginning of real life, out there. Laura thought about it every night. She didn't know exactly where she would go. The NGO had offered support for a while, but she needed to choose a path. Going back to the past was not an option. And building the future, although necessary, seemed scary. It was then that one of the psychologists gave her a suggestion. What if she applied for a scholarship? There was a national program for vulnerable young people. She could try a technical course, something that would get her moving without demanding too much at first. Laura considered the idea. Not because she wanted to leave in a hurry, but because she felt she was ready. Maybe she didn't trust the world completely yet, but she was starting to trust herself. And that was a bigger step than any other she had ever taken. That night, while filling out the scholarship form, Laura wrote her full name firmly. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed to write who she was. Because now, the name she carried was also a symbol of a story that would not surrender to silence. The day Laura left the shelter was silent. There was no party, no grand goodbyes. Just long looks, long hugs and a lump in her throat that not even she could get rid of. She carried a small suitcase in her hands, and on her shoulders an old weight that, for the first time, seemed lighter. Isadora cried. She asked her to write every day. Laura promised she would, but she knew that promise was impossible to keep in the way her friend expected. Life out there was different. Faster, harder, more demanding. But she didn't want to promise absence. She wanted to promise continuity. The NGO had found her a small room in a temporary shelter. A simple but safe space. It had a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out onto a quiet street. For the first time, Laura had a door that locked from the inside. That night, she slept with the light on. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the child she had been, the one who spent so many nights in the dark, praying that the door wouldn't slam shut. The light was now a symbol of choice. She could decide. In the days that followed, Laura immersed herself in her studies for the scholarship. The technical course in social psychology seemed like a natural path. She wanted to understand, in more depth, what was going on inside the girls she had met. And, perhaps, inside herself too. Classes would start soon, but she was already receiving the introductory materials. She spent hours reading, marking pages, writing down questions. It was like discovering a new language, one that explained in technical terms what she had experienced with her body, soul, and silence. During breaks, Laura continued writing. Now, no longer letters. She began drafting chapters of a new book. She didn't know if she would publish it. She was in no hurry. But she felt that there was a second story waiting to be born. No longer about the girl who survived, but about the woman who was learning to live. One day, as she was leaving a lecture at the NGO, she met a woman who approached her slowly. She was carrying a copy of the Book of Letters in her hands and simply said, "You're Elle, aren't you?" Laura remained silent. She didn't confirm it, but she didn't deny it either. And then, for the first time, she hugged one of her readers. The hug was long. So long that it seemed to stitch two stories together into one. The woman said she had left an abusive relationship after reading that book. She said Laura had given her courage, even without knowing it. And at that moment, Laura understood that the pain that had once almost destroyed her was now a bridge to rebuilding others. Over time, she began to be called to speak at closed meetings of the support network. She still didn't use her real name, but she no longer hid. Her voice was firm. Her presence, serene. And when she told pieces of her journey, people didn't hear a victim. They saw a clear-headed and empathetic survivor. Little by little, Laura found a routine. She woke up early, studied, did volunteer work with the NGO, and wrote at night. It wasn't an easy life, but it was hers. And it was new. Everything she had now had been built by her hands, with effort, pain, and silent courage. She still had nightmares. There were still days when the past would insinuate itself strongly, trying to invade the present. But now she knew how to deal with it. She knew how to breathe. She knew how to ask for help. She had tools. She had a network. She had a voice. One Sunday afternoon, sitting in the square near her home, she saw a girl selling drawings. It was Isadora, running, smiling, with a folder full of colors in her hands. The two embraced as if no time had passed. And for a few minutes, Laura allowed herself to just feel. There, under the clear sky and the distant noise of the city, Laura understood something essential. The past still lived within her, but it no longer ruled her life. And in that moment of reunion, everything made sense. Because the path to healing is not a point of arrival. It is a choice that is made every day. Adulthood arrived without asking permission. Responsibilities did not knock on the door, they invaded without warning. Bills, deadlines, decisions. Laura sometimes felt that she was always one step behind stability, as if life was constantly testing her resistance. But there was something different about her now. A strength built on pain, yes, but also on the daily choice to continue. Each decision she made was like a brick carefully placed in a new foundation. An internal home that, little by little, she learned to sustain. The technical course became an anchor. The classes on emotional development, trauma, active listening. Everything made sense on a visceral level. She didn't just learn with her mind. She learned with her body, with her memory, with her scar. The teachers noticed her dedication. Some saw her as promising, others said there was something special in the way she interpreted cases and responded to difficult stories. What no one knew was that Laura didn't study others. She studied herself in each example. In a practical activity, Laura was invited to simulate a listening circle with fictional teenagers. At the end, a classmate commented quietly, "You sound like someone who has held someone in pieces." And Laura smiled, not out of pride, but because she knew that, one day, she was that someone. When she returned home that day, she looked at the small room she now called home. On the desk lay the draft of the book that was slowly growing. This time, they were not letters. They were memories. Fragments transformed into chapters. Not to relive the pain, but to understand the journey. The NGO, noticing her growth, invited Laura to become a mediator for a new support group for at-risk adolescents. It was a huge leap. She would be on the front lines, dealing with fresh pain, open wounds, stories that seemed to echo her own. She hesitated. She didn't feel ready. But one of the coordinators looked her in the eye and said firmly, "Laura, you don't have to be completely healed to be on the path." That stayed in her mind for days, like a phrase that needed to mature. She accepted. With fear, yes. But with purpose. And in the first circle she moderated, when a girl with her eyes downcast said she was afraid to sleep because her stepfather was prowling around her room at night, Laura felt a chill in her chest. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she knew exactly what that girl was feeling. She took a deep breath. She gave space. She listened. And at the end, when everyone had already spoken, she said in a low but firm voice, "You are not alone. And it was never your fault." The girl didn't answer, but her moist eyes and slight nod said it all. That night, Laura cried alone in her room. Not out of sadness, but because she understood that, finally, she had crossed an invisible line. From victim to caregiver. From silence to voice. From survival to purpose. But she also knew that this role required balance. She couldn't save everyone. She couldn't forget about herself. And that was difficult. Sometimes she felt guilty for being okay while other girls were still bleeding. Therapy, which she never abandoned, helped her find her center again. One afternoon, walking through the city, she saw a store with a sign, "Part-time attendant needed." She went in without thinking much. The course and work at the NGO took up her time, but money was tight. She needed to learn how to support herself. She got the job. It wasn't her dream job, but it was a worthy one. And, at the counter of that store, she learned something else, that real life is in the details. In the sincere good morning. In the lady who asked for a discount. In the silence between one sale and the next. And as she put the bills in the cash register, she thought that each small achievement was part of something bigger. Laura's story was no longer just hers. It was about all the girls who once thought they wouldn't survive. And now, because of her, they knew they could do more. The days began to pass at a new speed. Laura divided her time between working at the store, studying, and the support group. It was tiring, sometimes exhausting, but never meaningless. For the first time, each bit of effort fit into a greater purpose. At the store counter, she learned how to deal with different types of people. The impatient, the polite, the indifferent. All of this helped her practice something that had been denied her for a long time: patience with others and, above all, with herself. With her first salary, she didn't buy clothes or spend on nonsense. She paid part of an online course on complex trauma and saved the rest. That small amount had immense value. It wasn't just money, it was autonomy. It was proof that she could support herself. On the quietest nights, she would sit at her desk and reread the chapters she had been writing. Sometimes she would cry, sometimes she would smile. Other times she felt nothing, just the silence of someone who learns to observe their own pain without having to drown in it. In the support group, one of the girls, after weeks of silence, finally told her story. When she finished, she looked at Laura and asked, "Have you ever been through something similar?" She hesitated. Then she answered honestly, "I did. And that's why I decided to be here." Trust was established in that environment. Little by little, Laura realized that she no longer needed to hide her scars. They didn't define her, but they were part of what made her capable of welcoming others without judgment. What had once been shame was now a tool. One morning, she received an unexpected call. An independent publisher had read excerpts from her blog, where, under a pseudonym, she shared her thoughts on resilience, and wanted to talk. They wanted to know if she had material for a book. Laura was shocked. She didn't tell anyone right away. It seemed too big, too scary. She still struggled with the fear of exposing herself, of being recognized, of reliving the past out loud. But something inside her, a seed of courage, began to germinate. The following week, she gathered the texts, adjusted the chapters, and scheduled an online meeting with the publisher. During the conversation, for the first time, she introduced herself by her real name. The publisher listened attentively and, at the end, said, "Your story can save lives. But only if you want to tell it." That night, Laura didn't sleep. She paced around her room, opened and closed her notebook, reread her old notes. She remembered every girl she had met, every sleepless night, every fear she had overcome. And she understood that perhaps it was time, not to forget the past, but to transform it into something greater. She decided to accept. On one condition: she wanted part of the proceeds from the book to go to the NGO that had taken her in. The publisher agreed. It was the beginning of something new. A new kind of courage, more mature, more conscious, more public. The next day, when she told Isadora, the two hugged in silence. No words were spoken, only the weight of what it meant. Laura was no longer just a survivor. She was becoming a reference. The following months were intense. Revisions, meetings, reflections. Each written line demanded responsibility. She didn't want sensationalism. She wanted truth. She wanted whoever read it to feel that it was possible to start over, even after the worst. When she held the first copy of the printed book, her fingers trembled. It was a simple object. A sober cover, a discreet title. But inside, each page was a piece of her soul carefully sewn together. She cried. Not out of sadness, but out of relief. In the dedication, she wrote something simple: "To all the girls who still believe they are alone, you are not." It was more than a sentence. It was a promise. A seed planted in a fertile soil of pain transformed into strength. And so, little by little, Laura began to emerge from the shadows. Not to erase what she had experienced, but to light the path of those who still walk in the dark. The book launch took place in a modest manner. A small room, simple chairs, a few familiar faces and others curious. There were no spotlights or major media. But for Laura, that was enough. It was more than she ever imagined she would achieve. When she took the microphone, her hands were shaking. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to take over her entire body. She did not read excerpts from the book. She chose to tell, with a choked voice, how each page was made up of sleepless nights, silent tears and the daily struggle to continue believing in her own existence. Among those present, a woman was crying softly. A teenager held the book to her chest. A man with a serious expression looked at the ground, visibly touched. Laura realized that her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who carried invisible pain. After the event, a line formed. Some wanted an autograph. Others just a hug. But most wanted to talk. To say that they had also suffered, that they had never had the courage to say it, that listening to Laura was like breathing after a long time trapped underwater. She listened to each one attentively. Not in a hurry, not out of obligation. It was as if each word spoken there was an echo of what she herself once needed to say and could not. In the end, she left exhausted, but fulfilled. She knew that that day was a milestone. As the weeks went by, the book began to circulate. Support groups, schools, communities. People began sending messages to the publisher asking for more copies. A school in the outskirts of town asked for a talk. A local radio program wanted an interview. Laura hesitated. Exposure was still a challenge. But little by little, she understood that she didn't need to memorize speeches or create a perfect image. She just had to be herself. And so it was. At school, she spoke to teenagers with attentive eyes and vulnerable hearts. On the radio, her voice trembled, but she spoke truthfully. The repercussions were endless. Some mothers wrote saying that, after reading the book, they noticed signs in their own children. They reported it. They protected it. And they thanked them. With each message, Laura felt the weight and honor of what she was building. But with the visibility came the shadows. People who said she was making it up to get attention. Cruel comments on social media. Empty accusations. Laura felt the blow. For days, she thought about disappearing from everything. Silencing herself again. It was Isadora who, once again, rescued her. She said firmly, "When a woman speaks the truth, she bothers people. And when that truth saves others, it becomes a threat to those who prefer silence." Laura took a deep breath and decided to continue. She reduced her social media use, prioritized human contact again, eye contact, real spaces. She realized that her power was not in numbers, but in connections. Each life touched was more important than 1,000 empty likes. A new girl arrived in the support group. Silent, withdrawn. Laura recognized her at once, not by her face, but by her gaze. It was like seeing herself years ago, and she understood, then and there, that her mission was just beginning. Over time, this girl also began to speak. And when she told her story, she used words that were in the book. She said that she felt less alone after reading it. Laura held back tears. She knew, at that moment, that it had all been worth it. And as she walked back home that night, she felt a cold wind on her face. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was like a whisper from life, saying, "You survived. Now you lead." And she believed it. The days went by quickly again. Laura was exhausted, but it was an exhaustion that brought meaning. With each new invitation, each email with words of gratitude, she felt that her voice had become an instrument of healing, for others and for herself. It was during a cloudy morning that the call came. An international NGO, specialized in the rights of children victims of violence, had read her book translated into English. They wanted to take her to a conference in Europe. They wanted her to tell her story in front of leaders, doctors, psychologists and lawyers from several countries. Laura felt her heart skip a beat. The world seemed to open a huge door in front of her, but along with it came old fears. Telling her story like that, in another language, on another continent, felt like she was handing over her past to the entire world. And that scared her. She hung up the phone without answering. She spent the whole day restless. She walked around the city, entered an empty church, sat on the last bench and remained silent. Everything around her was still. Inside her, the chaos of a decision that could change everything. That night, she spoke to Isadora. As always, her friend listened to her without interrupting. Then she said, with firm serenity, "You don't have to accept it out of vanity or pressure. But if there is a desire within you, even a small one, don't ignore it out of fear." Laura thought about this for days. She thought about the girls who still didn't have a voice. She thought about the child she had been, silent, invisible, asking for help without knowing how. She thought about the messages she still received, the hugs given in silence, the looks that said more than any words. She accepted the invitation. The process was intense. They prepared her speech in English and practiced her presentation with the help of a translator. But Laura decided that she would start by speaking in Portuguese, even if it was translated in real time. She wanted her words to come from her heart, in the language in which her pain was experienced and overcome. She arrived at the event accompanied by 2 representatives of the Brazilian NGO. The room was huge, the audience immense. Faces were attentive, many with translation headphones, all waiting. Laura went up on stage with trembling hands. She took a deep breath and began. Her words were not technical. They were human. She talked about her childhood, the forced silence, the hidden pain. She talked about the attempt to take her own life, about the unread letter, about the welcome, the reconstruction, and the choice to transform suffering into a path. With each sentence, the silence of the audience grew thicker. Some wept discreetly. Others clasped their hands in their laps. And at the end, Laura looked at everyone and said, "Pain only multiplies in silence. But when it is shared truthfully, it becomes strength." The applause was loud. But Laura didn't cry there. She just thanked them and walked off the stage with calm steps. Outside, she sat alone on a bench in the garden. She looked at the foreign sky and thought that, somehow, her pain had crossed oceans. And now, it was a bridge. At the hotel, That night, she received a message from the NGO coordinator. They wanted Laura to help build a safe listening program for girls at risk, inspired by her story. The project would start in her hometown. Laura smiled with sadness and courage. Returning to the place where it all began was a challenge that still hurt her. But she knew that, if she wanted to prevent others from going through what she had been through, then she would return. Not as a victim, but as a voice. That was what life asked of her now. Not to forget, not to run away, but to return firmly. Looking back at the past and finally rewriting it with her own hands. Not to erase the pain, but to give it a new name, hope. Returning to that place was like opening an old wound and sticking her fingers in it. The car drove along the road that led to her hometown and, through the window, Laura saw landscapes that seemed frozen in time. Everything was the same. But inside her, everything was different. Every street, every wall, every corner held a memory. The school gate where she cried silently during recess. The square where she sat alone while watching other children play. The old house, where silence screamed every night. Laura didn't return alone. She was accompanied by 2 psychologists from the project, a social worker and a camerawoman who would record the creation of the new shelter. But inside, she felt alone. As if no one could understand what it was like to set foot there again. Before any official agenda, she asked for a moment. She went to the house where she lived with her mother and stepfather. The facade had changed color. But the windows were still there, like eyes watching time pass. She didn't knock on the door. She just stood there on the other side of the street, still. It was in that silence that the tears came. Not tears of pain, but tears of confrontation. That place no longer had power over her. It was just an empty stage. The true prison had been broken inside her, a long time ago. Later, she visited the school where she studied. The current principal welcomed her with a warm hug. There was a small auditorium set up for the meeting with the students. Laura spoke calmly. Some teenagers listened to her in absolute silence. Others cried openly. It was there that she met Anna, a 13-year-old girl with deep-set eyes and almost whispered words. After the talk, Anna approached her and said, "What you said seemed to be about me." Laura held her hands. The cycle repeated itself. But now, she could intervene. The following afternoon, the welcoming listening space was inaugurated, baptized with the most symbolic name possible, Voices that were reborn. Laura cut the ribbon with steady hands. In that simple room, lined with pillows, soft pictures, and books on the shelves, girls could talk, without fear, without guilt, without silence. The community showed up. Teachers, mothers, volunteers. Many who had previously remained silent in the face of her suffering now looked at her with respect and admiration. Some apologized. Others simply hugged her in silence. Laura accepted it all. Without resentment. But without forgetting. That night, sitting on a bench in the square where she had cried alone so many times, Laura saw children running, laughing, living. A man was selling popcorn. Couples were walking. It was as if time had given the place back the life that she once believed would never exist there. She closed her eyes for a moment. The past still hurt, but now it was part of a path. And she understood that her mission was not just to tell her story. It was to ensure that others would not have to live it. Isadora called. She asked how she was. Laura answered with a single sentence, which came from the depths of her soul. Today I walked on the same ground that once broke me, but now, with firm feet. On the other end of the line, silence. Then, her friend said, "That's how you win." And Laura knew, at that moment, that the last page of her pain had been written. What was coming now was a new chapter, not of suffering, but of reconstruction, of strength, of a full life. And she was ready. Months had passed since her return to her hometown. Laura now lived between trips, lectures and meetings with other girls who, like her one day, didn't know how to turn their pain into words. She no longer carried shame, only truth, and with it, purpose. The Voices That Were Reborn project spread to other cities. The cozy room where girls could speak without being judged became a model replicated in small communities, where before there was only silence. Laura had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of resistance. Even in the face of recognition, she refused to be placed on a pedestal. She always repeated, "I am not a miracle. I am the consequence of someone who did not give up." And that was exactly what she taught, that it is possible to survive and flourish, even in the worst conditions. One afternoon, sitting in front of a group of girls in a new shelter, one of them raised her hand and asked, "Do you still feel angry with him today?" Laura took a deep breath. She thought. And she answered honestly, "I feel the anger that protects me, not the one that destroys me." The group fell silent. That felt liberating. No one had ever said that it was possible to feel angry and still move forward. No one had ever validated what many carried in secret: fear, hatred, guilt. Laura validated it all, and taught how to transform. She knew that her mission was far from over. With each girl she met, she felt that something inside her was also healing. It was as if each story she heard closed another small cut in her own soul. And, in the process, she started over with them. Isadora accompanied her on many of these journeys. They both knew that they were building something that went beyond any social project. It was a collective healing movement, a reminder to the world that listening is an act of love, and sometimes salvation. One night, back at home, Laura opened an old box that held letters that had never been delivered. There was the one she had written when she was 12, when she was about to give up. She reread it silently, her eyes brimming with tears, and then smiled. It was as if she could say to that little girl, "You did it." The next morning, she recorded a video. Sitting in her room, without makeup, without a script, without production. Just her and her truth. She spoke of pain, of overcoming, and of the power to transform wounds into strength. She ended with a firm whisper, "You are not alone. You never were." The video went viral within a few days. Comments came from all over the world. Men, women, teenagers, elderly people. Hidden stories came to light as if, with Laura's courage, other doors were finally opening. She read everything. She responded as much as she could. And in one of those comments, a phrase stuck with her: "Your story kept me from giving up last night. Thank you for existing." Laura cried. That was why she had told the story. not to reopen wounds, but to prevent others from getting deeper. With every step, she proved that it is possible not only to survive, but to truly live. Not to forget, but to choose what to do with what was left. Pain was no longer a prison. It was a bridge. It was a path. It was a beacon. Laura looked up at the sky that night and whispered something to herself. If my story reached one life, then it was worth it. And now, it's up to you. If Laura's story touched your heart, share this video. Like it, subscribe to the channel and spread this message. Because sometimes, all someone needs is to know that they are not alone. And remember, not all pain is the end. Sometimes, it is just the beginning of a new destiny.